Winston Churchill, born Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, came from an illustrious lineage. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent yet controversial political figure in 19th century Britain, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite from a wealthy family. Their union was emblematic of the Gilded Age, often blending American wealth with British aristocracy, though their marriage was fraught with unhappiness and scandal. Winston's early years mirrored the typical upbringing of the British upper class, with a strict nanny, elite schooling, and the expectation of military service. Despite initial academic struggles, he attended Harrow School and later the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. Commissioned into the British Army, his early military career took him to Cuba, India, and Sudan, where he gained first-hand experience of British imperialism. These adventures also marked the start of his prolific writing career, as he penned dispatches for British newspapers and published books about his experiences. Churchill's time in India and Sudan shaped many of his views on empire and governance. However, he also demonstrated a critical perspective, notably questioning the brutal tactics employed during campaigns in Sudan. His literary pursuits grew alongside his military service, culminating in works like The River War, which analyzed the British campaigns in Sudan. In 1899, Churchill sought to enter politics, standing as a conservative candidate in Oldham. Though unsuccessful, he quickly returned to action, this time in South Africa during the Second Boer War. There, his daring escape from Boer captivity made headlines, cementing his reputation as a bold and resourceful figure. These early experiences laid the foundation for his later political and literary achievements, ultimately shaping one of the most iconic careers of the 20th century. After escaping captivity during the Second Boer War, Winston Churchill rejoined the British Army in South Africa. He participated in the siege of Ladysmith and witnessed the capture of Pretoria in 1900. However, he left before the guerrilla phase of the conflict, during which Britain employed controversial tactics, including scorched earth policies and concentration camps. Upon returning to Britain, Churchill published Ian Hamilton's March, detailing his experiences in the war. Churchill's fondness for alcohol became evident during this period. Known for his high-functioning alcoholism, he maintained a structured drinking routine, which, despite its scale, did not impair his extraordinary productivity throughout his career. In 1900, Churchill entered Parliament as a Conservative MP for Oldham after a snap general election called by Lord Salisbury. However, his progressive views, favoring free trade and opposing conservative stances on military spending and Irish Home Rule, isolated him within the party. By 1904, he crossed the aisle to join the Liberal Party, where he thrived, supporting social reforms and aligning with rising figures like David Lloyd George. Churchill married Clementine Hosier in 1908, a partnership rooted in genuine affection and mutual respect. Together, they raised 5 children, though the tragic death of their third daughter, Marigold, deeply affected him. The family eventually settled at Chartwell, a home that became a lifelong retreat. During his Liberal tenure, Churchill introduced significant labor reforms as president of the Board of Trade and later served as Home Secretary, navigating challenges like suffragist movements and labor unrest. In 1911, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, overseeing Britain's naval dominance during the lead-up to World War I. As war loomed, Churchill championed an ambitious but ultimately disastrous campaign to seize the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915. Aimed at defeating the Ottoman Empire and opening new fronts, the operation suffered from strategic miscalculations, leading to a protracted stalemate and heavy Allied losses. The Gallipoli failure marked a turning point in Churchill's career, forcing his resignation from the Admiralty and casting a shadow over his wartime legacy. Despite setbacks, Churchill's dynamic political career and his ability to adapt and rebound from challenges would define him as one of Britain's most enduring figures. The aftermath of the failed Gallipoli campaign in 1915 marked a major setback in Winston Churchill's career. With mounting criticism and loss of confidence from the wartime cabinet, Churchill was removed as First Lord of the Admiralty. Determined to rebuild his reputation, he rejoined the military in 1916, serving on the Western Front in France, where he gained a deeper understanding of the hardships faced by soldiers. This experience influenced his advocacy for improved soldier equipment, such as the introduction of steel helmets. In 1917, the Dardanelles Commission cleared Churchill of direct responsibility for the Gallipoli disaster. His political fortunes revived under David Lloyd George, who appointed him Minister of Munitions. In this role, Churchill oversaw the production of arms and managed labor disputes, contributing significantly to Britain's wartime economy. Britain and its allies ultimately won the war in 1918 due to their resilient economies and resource management, despite Germany's military successes. Following the war, Churchill held dual roles as Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air. He played a key role in demobilizing troops and navigating the volatile post-war landscape, including civil unrest across Europe and the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. He supported anti-Bolshevik efforts, including British military interventions in northern Russia, and advocated for a cautious approach toward post-war Germany, recognizing its potential as a future ally. Churchill's tenure as Secretary of State for the Colonies, 1921 to 1922, highlighted his complex legacy. He managed British mandates in the Middle East, including contentious governance in Iraq and Palestine, and played a central role in negotiating the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which granted partial independence to Ireland. However, his support for controversial policies, such as the use of paramilitary forces in Ireland and proposals to experiment with chemical weapons in Iraq, tarnished his reputation. In 1924, Churchill rejoined the Conservative Party, recognizing the declining influence of the Liberals amidst the rise of Labour. He won a parliamentary seat in Epping and was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. His decision to return Britain to the gold standard had mixed consequences, stabilizing inflation but contributing to widespread unemployment, particularly in industrial sectors like coal and steel. The 1930s marked Churchill's wilderness years, during which he was excluded from government. Despite this, he remained active, dedicating himself to writing and warning against the growing threat of Nazi Germany. His literary achievements during this period included The World Crisis, a 6-volume history of World War I, and Marlborough, His Life and Times, a biography of his ancestor. These years, though politically isolating, proved foundational for the life and times of his ancestor John Churchill, 1st Duke of Moore. Although Churchill conceived it as an unabashed tribute to M'Bra and his accomplishments, the study, which ran to 4 large volumes of approximately 200,000 words each, was very well received, providing not just an account of John Churchill's life, but of the politics of Britain and Europe in the time of King Louis XIV of France and the War of the Spanish Succession. The American political philosopher Leo Strauss deemed it to be the greatest historical work written during the 20th century. Today, it reads better than most other works of historical prose written in the first half of the 20th century, and above all, it captures Aimeri's significance as a political and military figure. His victory over the French at the Battle of Blum in 1704 was a defining moment in Britain's checking of French growth under Louis XIV, and paved the way for Britain to begin eclipsing France as the preeminent European power in the course of the 18th century. Churchill's text captures the significance of all of this like few other works written on Mora and his times beyond his study and back in Parliament. Churchill was a passionate voice on another product of Britain's 18th century expansion. The position of India. For years, debate had been raging on what would happen to the British Raj, or Crown rule, with calls for independence impossible to ignore completely. By the 1930s, there appeared to be 3 options: either a form of devolved government, or becoming a dominion like Australia and New Zealand, or perhaps complete independence would be granted. In the early 1930s, both Labour and the Conservatives largely agreed on the idea that India should be granted dominion status, a legal position which would effectively make India self-governing on a wide range of internal matters, but would ensure that it remained nominally under the jurisdiction of the British Empire. Most importantly, London would still determine India's foreign policy and military affairs. This arrangement, though, was anathema for Churchill, who became even more trenchantly imperialist and monarchical in his political ideology. As he grew older, he was especially disdainful of the principal Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi, and the Indian National Congress, which he led. Part of this was also owing to Churchill's perception of many subject peoples as being less evolved than the British. To his mind, India was not ready socially, culturally, or politically to govern itself. and he strongly argued throughout the 1930s that, quote, if India could look after herself, we would delight it. Unsurprisingly, when the India Bill came before Parliament in December 1934 and proposed a great amount of self-governance for India, he voted against the ACT, which ultimately, though, would pass Churchill's vocal opposition to. Self-government for India and his criticisms of Gandhi, in particular, might well have had a bearing on matters closer to home. In the early 1930s, Churchill also began sounding the alarm concerning the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in the first weeks of 1933, and the Nazis quickly turned the country into a one-party state. As early as April 1933, Churchill gave a speech in the British House of Commons in which he spoke about what he called the odious conditions in Germany as the months went by and the Nazis began rearming Germany in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end. Churchill lambasted government policy, which was failing to recognize the threat posed by a revitalized German military. He was especially critical of the failure to create a new, modern, well-appointed British Air Force, and the rapidity with which the German Luftwaffe overtook the British RAF from 1935 onwards. Yet Churchill's warning calls were ignored in some circles, in part because he had lost credibility amongst a significant number of MPs, owing to his virulent objections to Indian self-government and the manner in which he had launched scathing attacks against Gandhi's character. Perhaps many wondered Churchill's critique of Hitler and the Nazis was similarly misinformed. Churchill would continue to warn the British political establishment of the dangers of the Nazis into the mid-1930s and beyond. Despite this, many failed to see the danger. This should perhaps be seen in context. The 1930s was a time of extremist politics. Italy had been controlled by Benito Mussolini and his fascists since the early 1920s, and a vicious civil war would soon grip Spain. For many within the political sphere in Britain, Hitler and the Nazis were not viewed as the primary threat within this political landscape. Rather, the greater threat seemed to be posed by the Soviet Union and its authoritarian leader Joseph Stalin. The fear was that if Moscow aligned, communist movements emerged and seized power in a number of Central and Western European nations, then Russia would soon be in a position to dominate the continent. Viewed from this perspective, the Nazis were the lesser of two evils, and certainly a bulwark against the rise of radical socialism. Indeed, in 1936, Churchill's old ally in government during the First World War, David Lloyd George, visited Germany, met Hitler, and reported back enthusiastically on what the Germans were doing to rebuild their country following the shock of the Great Depression. It was for these reasons that many people either did not see the threat posed by the Nazis in the same way, which Churchill did in the 1930s, or else refused to see it. This was not for the want of trying on the former Chancellor of the XR part. In an effort to bring greater awareness to the issue, he even aligned himself in the mid-1930s with the Anti-Nazi Council, a British political organization, which had arisen out of the left-wing movement in England. In order to work alongside them, Churchill toned down his opposition to the Soviet Union within the council, a focus group consisting of virulent opponents of the Nazis and the British manifestation of fascism. Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists emerged, which included figures such as Austen Chamberlain, the half-brother of Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Stanley Baldwin as leader of the Conservatives and became Prime Minister in 1937, and other conservative politicians such as Robert Boothby and Henry Pigcroft. Collectively, they organized rallies and meetings which sought to draw attention to the risks of appeasing Germany, while it also worked with members of the civil service and intelligence services to produce concrete evidence of how extensive the German rearmament program was. Despite these efforts, in the mid-1930s, the message of Churchill and his allies seemed to be falling on completely deaf ears. There were distractions within British politics, not the least of which was the crisis which followed from the accession of King Edward VII. As the new monarch in January 1936, Edward was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorce who was unacceptable to British social norms by the standards of the 1930s. A constitutional crisis followed, one which was only resolved at the end of that year, when Edward abdicated in favor of his younger brother, who became King George V. The upshot of the abdication crisis was that the issue of German rearmament and the increasingly jingoistic attitude of Hitler and the Nazis towards their neighbors were largely shelled throughout 1936. Moreover, unbeknownst to the political establishment, a further setback occurred in the early summer of 1937 when Stanley Baldwin retired from political life and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Neville Chamberlain over the next year and a half.